Welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist, the Freedom from Religion Foundation's weekly Facebook Live. I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor, co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
I'm Andrew Seidel, a constitutional attorney and FFRF's Director of Strategic Response.
And I'm Liz Cavell, one of 9 constitutional attorneys here at FFRF. Today, we're going to celebrate the anniversary of the adoption of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which, as of yesterday, is 232 years old.
And its principles perhaps have never been under more attack than now, and it's never been more timely to study the Statute of Religious Freedom.
We celebrate this anniversary as Religious Freedom Day because of a law that the Virginia legislature adopted. It was written by Thomas Jefferson, and it is the bedrock principle of the American experiment, religious freedom. Jefferson was so proud of its creation and adoption that he actually had it inscribed on his tombstone that he was the author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom.
His tombstone mentions only 3 things: his authorship of this statute, his authorship of the Declaration of American Independence, and that he was the father of the University of Virginia. And to quote Jefferson, he said that he chose these 3 achievements, quote, because by these, as testimonials that I have lived, I wish most to be remembered.
And it's always amazed me that Jefferson did not think it rated even to mention that he served as our nation's 3rd president on his tombstone. But that shows how important he felt his statute for religious freedom was to civil rights and to history. And I've asked Andrew today to narrate the words of the statute so we can really let them sink in, and we'll play that in a minute. But in this week, also celebrating Martin Luther King Jr.'s birth, and only a few days after we've witnessed our current president spew a vilely racist epithet toward Africa, Haiti, and many immigrants, I also thought that it's important to briefly address Jefferson's own hypocrisy and racism.
Absolutely. Jefferson regarded slavery as a time bomb involving what he called, quote, the most unremitting despotism on the one part and degrading submission on the other. But his cynical words of condemnation of slaveholders applied to his own actions as well, to what Jefferson called justice on one scale and self-preservation in the other.
Right. He depended on slavery to maintain his cherished lifestyle and his home at Monticello. And he was conscious of the fact that it degraded his humanity, but nevertheless, Jefferson owned up to 600 slaves. He freed only 2 men during his lifetime and only 5 upon his death. And he did not free his slave, Sally Hemings.
And it's a little known fact here in Madison, Wisconsin, that Jefferson's son, Eston Hemings Jefferson, whose mother was Sally Hemings, is buried right here in Madison, Wisconsin. In fact, at the Forest Hill Cemetery. He was buried in 1856, and I live right next door to that cemetery. So Jefferson placed his pocketbook above the civil rights and human rights of other human beings. So in honoring his statue today, we are making clear that we are not honoring Jefferson's legacy in toto. He was sadly not a revolutionary when it came to race or sex, quite the opposite. But Jefferson was a revolutionary when it came to his pioneering work to separate state and church, and that's what the rest of this program is about.
Now, I think it's important that we, especially we skeptics, atheists, and non-believers, not treat the founders as if they were gods or demigods. You know, they were these fallible human beings with virtues and serious flaws. Jefferson penned the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom 9 years before it was actually passed in 1786, and at the time, he was our minister in France. Now, James Madison actually introduced and shepherded the landmark law through the General Assembly, and it was Madison who would use it as the precursor of the First Amendment. So here it is, Thomas Jefferson's historic Statute for Religious Freedom. The impious presumption of legislators and rulers, civil as well as ecclesiastical, who being themselves but fallible and uninspired men, have assumed dominion over the faith of others, setting up their own opinions and modes of thinking as the only true and infallible, and as such, endeavoring to impose them on others, have established and maintained false religions over the greatest part of the world and through all time. That to compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves is sinful and tyrannical. That even the forcing him to support this or that teacher of his own religious persuasion is depriving him of the comfortable liberty of giving his contributions to the particular pastor whose morals he would make his pattern, and whose power he feels most persuasive to righteousness, and is withdrawing from the ministry those temporary rewards which, proceeding from an approbation of their personal conduct, are an additional incitement to earnest and unremitting labors for the instruction of mankind. That our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions, any more than our opinions in physics or geometry. That therefore the prescribing any citizen as unworthy the public confidence by laying upon him an incapacity of being called to offices of trust and emolument, unless he profess or renounce this or that religious opinion, is depriving him injuriously of those privileges and advantages to which, in common with his fellow citizens, he has a natural right. That it tends only to corrupt the principles of that religion it is meant to encourage by bribing, with a monopoly of worldly honors and emoluments, those who would externally profess and conform to it. That though indeed these are criminal, who do not withstand such temptation, yet neither are those innocent who lay the bait in their way. That to suffer the civil magistrate to intrude his powers into the field of opinion, and to restrain the profession or propagation of principles on supposition of their ill tendency, is a dangerous fallacy, which at once destroys all religious liberty, because he being of course judge of that tendency will make his opinions the rule of judgment, and approve or condemn the sentiments of others only as they shall square with or differ from his own. That it is time enough for the rightful purposes of civil government for its officers to interfere when principles break out into overt acts against peace and good order. And finally, that truth is great and will prevail if left to herself, that she is the proper and sufficient antagonist to error, and has nothing to fear from the conflict unless by human interposition disarmed of her natural weapons, free argument and debate, errors ceasing to be dangerous when it is permitted freely to contradict them. We, the General Assembly of Virginia, do enact that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. And though we well know that this assembly, elected by the people for the ordinary purposes of legislation only, have no power to restrain the acts of succeeding assemblies, constituted with powers equal to our own, and that therefore to declare this act irrevocable would be of no effect in law. Yet we are free to declare, and do declare, that the rights hereby asserted are of the natural rights of mankind, and that if any act shall be hereafter passed to repeal the present, or to narrow its operation, such act will be an infringement of natural right. I actually love that ending, and it's really creative. We could talk about it in a minute maybe. But to summarize, the Statute for Religious Freedom is predicated on a government free from religion. Jefferson pointed out that the ability of a civil authority to intrude into religious opinions and declare them heretical destroys all religious liberty. And the second principle really embedded in there that's important today is that religious freedom is not absolute. The government can step in when opinions become actions. The freedom of belief is absolute. The freedom to act on those beliefs is not.
And a majority of state constitutions replicate the heart of the Statute for Religious Freedom, including the state constitution here in Wisconsin, which promises that no citizen can be compelled to attend, erect, or support any place of worship.
But this bedrock principle is under attack, specifically by a decision last year by the Supreme Court known as Trinity Lutheran.
And we'll also discuss the statute's relevance today with the masterpiece Cake case, which is before the Supreme Court right now, and talk about how a new regulation by FEMA is going to force taxpayers to be compelled to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which they disbelieve.
So how about a quick recap of the Trinity Lutheran decision, which the Supreme Court disregarded the equivalent of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom that's in the Missouri state constitution and said it's okay to tax Missouri taxpayers to support a place of worship in Missouri. Do we want to just have a quick recap on that decision from last year?
Sure. So, I mean, this was before the Supreme Court, and as you said, it involved a case out of Missouri. Trinity Lutheran was a church, and they were trying to resurface their playground to get rid of the pea gravel and rubberize it. And they were trying to get access to a public fund that was specifically set up for that purpose. And the public fund said, actually, we can't do that. There's a state constitution that prohibits us from funding churches and religion. They sued, and the Supreme Court said the law says that churches need not apply, and that discriminates against churches, and therefore they should be able to get access.
So much for the state constitution. And of course, it was of narrow grounds, but we are waiting for this to play out, and we're already seeing a lot of pushback.
We are seeing some fallout from it already. It was narrowly decided, and there are some positive aspects of the decision in terms of how it was limited, that this was actually a playground. The court didn't, even though the playground was tied to a church, the court didn't look at it as really being a religious aspect of the church. For instance, helping the church propagate their doctrine the way it would for a church building or something like that.
They're ignoring the fact that money is fungible, and so if the church doesn't have to raise funds for the playground, those funds are available now for the propagation of religion or other sectarian, campaigns.
Right, and also ignoring the fact that by the church's own admission, the preschool to the church is an essential part of propagating its religion, indoctrinating the next generation of little Lutherans, and evangelizing preschool children is the essential mission of their preschool. Any part of their preschool, the physical plant of their preschool, it's ludicrous to separate that out as not having any kind of religious use to the church itself. But in any event, that was some limiting feature of the facts of the case for the justices that voted in the church's favor.
And that was a point that Justice Sotomayor in dissent really hit the majority hard with. She basically said you can't separate out this. The church thinks this is part of their religious mission, so it's not for us to separate it out, which is, as Liz said, right on point.
So on this week of celebrating the Virginia Statute, 232 years, it's endangered. I mean, it's a wake-up call. We're in trouble. And we're in trouble in other ways. So we want to talk about the Masterpiece Cake case, where we're waiting for a Supreme Court decision.
Right. So this case is coming out of the state of Colorado, and it originated in 2012 with a gay couple who, after marrying in another state, back then gay marriage was still illegal in Colorado, were planning to have a reception in their home state of Colorado. So they were shopping for wedding reception things, including a wedding cake. They went into the Masterpiece Cakeshop, where sort of everyone agrees this was a less than 2-minute encounter where they were browsing through a photo portfolio of cakes. The owner came out and realized the situation and said, I'm sorry, I don't make cakes for gay weddings. And so that led the couple to file a complaint with the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, who found that the baker did discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation, which is illegal under state law in Colorado. Colorado has an anti-discrimination statute that prohibits places of public accommodation, which means retail businesses like a bakery or a restaurant, and many other retail businesses. They're prohibited by law from discriminating, refusing to serve certain customers on certain bases like race and sex, and in Colorado, sexual orientation. So the baker appealed that decision of the commission to the Colorado Court of Appeals and to the Colorado Supreme Court, and that decision was upheld all the way. The U.S. Supreme Court has agreed to hear his appeal, and so...
Which is never a great sign.
It's not a great sign. Right now he's losing, and he's been losing all the way up, and now the U.S. Supreme Court thinks there's a reason to weigh in. That's not promising, and he's making some really scary arguments, including that the free exercise clause of the U.S. Constitution gives him the right to ignore Colorado state law and to discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation because his religious beliefs dictate that he should and he must. And so we're seeing the free exercise being used, as a sword and not a shield to allow what is a retail business, really, a bakery, to discriminate and violate the
civil rights
of customers.
And you want to tie this into Jefferson's ideas and the statute for religious liberty?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, one of the central principles of Jefferson's statute is that the government cannot regulate belief, but it can regulate action. So the baker here is absolutely free to believe, as he stated, and I think this is pretty close to an accurate quote, that Jesus was a carpenter and I don't think he would have made a bed for their wedding. He's free to believe that. That's fine. Nobody's saying he can't believe that. But he can't then use his business to refuse to provide service in violation of the state law, because then his actions are infringing the rights of another, and there is no religious right to infringe the rights of others. And that is exactly what Jefferson was talking about when he said it's fine for the government to step in when people start to act, but not fine for the government to regulate or legislate belief.
And I think I'm pretty proud of the fact that you two just taught a CLE class, continuing legal education class, which attorneys must take, right? Certain number of credits every 2 years, and you also got credit for it. And this was in Madison, Wisconsin. That was last week. You want to, you were invited in part because FFRF wrote an amicus brief in this case, where you were the principal author. And so briefly, how did that CLE class go?
That's right. So this was for the Legal Association for Women. It's a specialty bar organization here in Dane County that focuses on advancing the interests of women in the law and in the legal profession. They invited us to their monthly luncheon to give a 1-hour CLE, which is a continuing legal education seminar, basically focusing on Masterpiece Cakeshop, this case, and what it means for, the state of the law regarding the religion clauses. And we're the experts, certainly in Dane County, on this issue. And, there's not that many people focusing on religion and constitutional issues. And so, it was a really interesting and well-attended seminar, and I think definitely generated a lot of questions. I think a lot of people are really aghast at what's being argued and what's being entertained by many Supreme Court justices right now, and only time will tell what they will do. Argument was heard on this case in December, and so
we could be getting a decision, mid-spring?
This summer, I would think.
Yeah, it'll be late.
Summer.
And it was hard, the end of our presentation where we tried to sort of give some predictions and, talk about the potential consequences was a bit grim because, you said,
Kennedy's the swing vote, right?
And and the scary thing about the case is that it really does have the potential to redefine religious liberty as we've known it for 200 years. It has the potential to change it from that right to believe to a right to act on that belief.
And
no
the
matter
right
what.
to also inflict your belief on others and deny them civil rights.
Exactly.
Right, and to paraphrase Justice Breyer during the oral argument, to undermine every civil rights law since year 2, which is really the heart of what's at issue here. The Supreme Court is entertaining the argument that Colorado and other states and municipal bodies like Madison don't have a right to regulate the actions of commercial businesses who hold religious beliefs that dictate that their actions be otherwise.
And there's a law pending here in the state of Wisconsin to that effect that would take away the right of the city of Madison, for example, to enact its own civil rights ordinances. If for example, atheism is now a protected class. So what will happen with that?
Yeah, we're
And
watching
so
that
many
one
protected
closely.
classes.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's time to take alarm, as James Madison would say.
At the first experiment on our liberties,
That's
absolutely.
right. Now, speaking of taking alarm, there was very, very bad news last week. A directive from FEMA that had basically been written or ordered by President Trump. Do you want to talk about that, Andrew?
Sure. So this essentially would allow churches to recover disaster relief funds from FEMA. And now there's kind of two pots of money out there. This is oversimplifying things a lot and trying not to get too in the weeds. But if you provide government services during a hurricane, say Harvey, you let people in your doors and they ruin your carpet and they back up your plumbing and all that, anybody can get funds for that. Nobody's concerned about that here. We're talking just about the government giving out money to just repair buildings here and there. And they've now said that churches can get access to that money and other houses of worship. And that's exactly what Jefferson was talking about again in the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom. This is taxpayer funds going directly to churches so that they can repair after hurricane damage.
And of course, do you want to talk about what the status quo was before this by FEMA?
Yeah, I mean, before this, that was not an option. There was a big push after Superstorm Sandy, and the number of state church groups, including FFRF and AU, successfully repelled that attempt to change the FEMA regs. But right now, FEMA just unilaterally said we're changing the interpretation of the regulations so that we can give it to church, and doing it partly in light of recent Supreme Court decisions.
And in light of the Texas hurricane, because we had some churches suing FEMA over this, and that's when President Trump weighed in.
Yes, and the one court to issue an opinion on it already said that no, there is no reason that churches would get access to this. It's not a question of unfairness or discrimination, and it is mandated by the Constitution. So the one court to kind of look at the issue already disagrees with FEMA. So it's a little bit alarming that FEMA thinks they can go ahead then and just change their interpretation of their own regulations when a church has said that that is an incorrect interpretation.
Well, it's no coincidence, though, that this is coming a year after the Trinity Lutheran decision, which, for better or worse, is emboldening FEMA to act in this way and giving them, I think, some, support for their argument that, somehow churches are constitutionally entitled to access this money because, just like the playground preschool in Trinity Lutheran, they are otherwise eligible for it and shouldn't be excluded just because of their religious character. Of course, there's no limit to what FEMA funds can be used to repair.
Well, but there is, because they didn't change the directive when it came to applying to other nonprofit groups and some other artistic.
Yeah, but once you get the money, I think is
right.
what Liz was referring to.
I
mean the church.
Yeah, the church could be repairing crucifixes.
Unlike the playground, which we can
I
all, adopt the fiction that the playground is somehow separate from the religious use. When we're talking about, repairing actual houses of worship that were damaged, we're talking about anything: the steeple, the facade, the interior, the pews, whatever it is that.
And we just got a great victory. In fact, in Alaska, in Sitka, Ryan Jane, one of our attorneys, got the city to to withdraw a $5,000 grant to repair this Russian Orthodox exterior church. But, concerning, we got that victory, but what will be coming down the pike. But I was wondering who would have the standing to sue over this FEMA, and because they did extend this only to churches and not to other groups that have been refused this in the past, it would seem to me that might be one way to go.
And that's a discussion that a lot of the attorneys are having, especially among all the groups, and that we're looking at ways to actually take a challenge in court, and who's the person who is injured in a way that can actually bring the lawsuit. That's the standing requirement.
Because it's showing a preference, when you're looking at nonprofits, it's showing a preference only for religion.
Absolutely. It's not that FEMA said now anybody whose building is damaged in a storm has access to these funds. They just added churches to that list. That's it. And it's a very limited list. Now,
here in Wisconsin, in some ways, we've considered that our state constitution and its dictates about how you can't compel a citizen to attend, direct, or support a place of worship, that's really been dead since the early 90s, because our state Supreme Court was the first court to approve vouchers, and that was in the Milwaukee case. So
which has been a disaster for Milwaukee.
and for the nation. I mean, it was the foot in the door, and now it's spreading everywhere, and very unfortunate. So we have been seeing attacks against this very important clause in our state constitutions for a long while, but now it's really full frontal.
Well, I mean, we have been seeing it all over. In Colorado, for instance, I went and testified before the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, the Committee on Civil Rights, about whether or not they should repeal this part of their state constitution, which says that people can't be forced to fund a house of worship. In Florida right now, there's a Florida Constitutional Committee which is considering repealing the Florida provision that we've submitted testimony on.
And they've done that. I mean, that bill has been there before. Also, Michigan, the no aid clause. I mean, these are years and years of the religious right trying to eradicate these protections, but now it's looking more dangerous.
And I think what people are failing to understand is that what we mentioned at the top, which is that for you to have true religious freedom, you have to have a government that is free from religion. Without a secular government, religious freedom cannot exist. And if you're a Christian thinking, yeah, but I want taxpayer money to be able to repair my church, you also have to remember that same taxpayer money is going to be able to repair mosques and the Scientology building in downtown, wherever, California, that's been damaged by the wildfires. It's not just your religion that is going to be singled out. It's every religion out there is going to have access to these funds.
Not to mention you're accepting whatever responsibilities come with and whatever entanglements come with government funds and government oversight. When you're accepting grants, you have to be prepared to account for finances, account for how money is spent, account year after year for progress or what's being done on a particular grant. There's really a lot of government involvement and oversight that comes along with receiving taxpayer funds and specific grants. As there should be, and churches are not accustomed to that level of government scrutiny, and they're not accustomed to, opening their books and opening their records for public scrutiny. And that's something I think that a lot of churches don't realize when they're saying, hey, we can't be excluded, and we want more, more, more.
Yeah.
And it's our motto at the Freedom from Religion Foundation: where public money goes, public accountability must follow.
Yeah, and regulation always follows the money. And I think it's a great point that many believers don't understand, is that, if you're going to accept this, you are going to be regulated by the government. But of course, they want to have their cake and eat it too. They want the money and none of the regulation.
They want their masterpiece cake
and
eat it too. And I guess the other point, maybe before we take some questions or comments, is that many people came to this country to escape the tyranny of church states, where they were taxed or tithed to support places of worship that they did not believe in. And so are we going to go back to this era that so many people came here to escape from? We're going to start taxing citizens to support places of worship that they don't believe in? It's very sad.
It's sinful and tyrannical,
That's
as
right.
Jefferson said. So we do have a few questions. So Mark Shasha asks, what can we do about the Trinity Lutheran decision? How can we fight it? It is the beginning of a slippery slope.
Yep.
Good question.
It sure is. Really, like we were discussing earlier, it's contain right now. It's containment. It's how can it be limited, and how can we continue to defend against these arguments that individuals and churches and businesses and groups don't have these religious free exercise rights to engage in actions that both violate other secular laws or violate the Establishment Clause. We're just trying to contain this argument. Trinity Lutheran is on the books now, and all we can do is try and limit it to its facts, which were very specific and very made it, I think, easier for the justices to really buy into. And
was it a 5-4 decision?
No, it wasn't.
6-3.
It was 6-3, yeah.
Yeah.
So that makes it pretty solid.
So yeah, it's a bad decision, and it has the potential to really broaden what free exercise means. But I think we're trying to keep it contained to its facts and argue that the broader free exercise law, decades and decades of law, which say that actions can be regulated, free exercise can be burdened, and that the Establishment Clause also is equally important in terms of favorable and preferential treatment to churches and supporting churches with government funds and all that. So we're trying to just keep it contained and limit it to the facts of Trinity Lutheran going forward.
Yeah,
In
I think
your
that's right.
amicus, I mean, you turned your testimony last year in Colorado into an amicus in a
Correct.
voucher case in Colorado.
Correct.
And you pointed out that there's been broad attacks against what they call, I always think it should be called the Jefferson Amendment, but it's called the Blaine Amendment.
Yeah.
And there's this contention, oh, this is anti-Catholic. This was a backlash to Catholic immigrants who wanted parochial schools, and they adopted this. State constitutions all over suddenly adopted this Jeffersonian language that you can't compel someone to support church schools or places of worship. But you had some interesting thoughts on that in this
Yeah,
amicus.
I mean, historically, that's just not the case. I mean, some of the first schools to be denied funding under these provisions were Protestant schools. So it's not just this anti-Catholic provision that the religious right argues it is. And it's an effective argument because nobody wants to support a bigoted law. It's just, it's divorced from actual facts and history.
And wasn't Blaine's mother Catholic?
Yes, she was.
So
I
that's
mean,
an interesting
and
piece.
even here in Wisconsin too, you know, the Weiss decision, which has some of the language that we love to quote in our letters, actually also it decided that Bible reading in public schools was not okay. It actually used the funding provision of the Wisconsin.
The no funding provision.
Exactly, and
it was Catholic parents suing the town of Edgerton, which is near Madison.
Bingo, yeah. That's
Because
the
they
exact
were
point.
Protestant, they were reading occasionally from the Protestant Bible.
Yeah.
And so in 1890, that Weiss decision said there is no such cause of strife, malignant war, opposition, all chaos in the state as religion. Keep it out of our schools.
Yeah, so to say that a Catholic family used an anti-Catholic provision to keep religion out of the public schools is a little bit silly, really, when you come down to it. So it doesn't, the facts on the ground don't bear the argument out, I think.
And that wasn't the only early case brought by Catholics. Catholics were,
There were lots.
when they were a minority in this country, they were the freedom fighters for keeping religion out of schools.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of Enlightenment thinkers who observed that when they're in the minority, every religion or sect wants separation of state and church. It's only when they get to the majority that they start thinking, well, maybe this isn't such a good thing. So we have Emma B., who says, I was reading that some Americans don't believe Muslims and atheists have the same First Amendment rights as Christians because they say that America is a Christian nation. What can we do to better educate people on what the Constitution really says?
Gosh, this is what we've been doing for 40 years. This is our 40th year as a national group, and the Christian nation myth just hangs in there, and it is the greatest bugaboo we fight, I think. It's just a chronic myth, and we must debunk it. And you in the audience, you hear that myth, you read it in a newspaper, letter to the editor, write a response and debunk it, because it's the big lie technique.
Yeah, and if you don't want to, let FFRF know, you know, this is one of the things that we exist not just to litigate these issues, but also to educate and to separate. So we're happy to do some of that letter writing and op-eds and all of that as well.
Yep, and Christian nation, this is just a total myth when we have a godless and secular constitution, and the founders of our country, however flawed in some ways, got it right when it came to separating religion from government.
Absolutely.
That's right. And the idea that atheists or Muslims or any other minority group don't have equal rights or equal protection under the First Amendment kind of ties back to what Andrew was just saying, which is the majority religious group really has a warped view of what the religion clauses mean and what they protect. And it's a really dangerous position to adopt, because in an increasingly pluralistic America where Christians are fast becoming a minority group themselves, you know, these protections protect us all from any government-imposed religious preference and any interference in our own religious beliefs or practices or non-belief or whatever the case may be. So really, you know, it's a symptom of really this idea that when you're in the majority religion, you know, the Free Exercise Clause really protects you, and the Establishment Clause really doesn't apply to your religion, because the majority of the people want, you know, a certain religion to be the official religion, or don't mind when government promotes or endorses Christianity. Well, that's not how our Constitution was envisioned.
Or, I mean, it's also great ignorance about the Bill of Rights.
Right.
I mean, it just seems like so many individuals who make these claims have no concept of what the Bill of Rights means, that individual rights are protected, rights of conscience are protected from the majority.
Yeah, we often say the Bill of Rights exists to protect the minority from the tyranny of the majority.
And that was, I can't remember who did that study, but that was very disturbing, that many people do feel atheists and Muslims do not have the same rights as other Americans. And they act like that sometimes.
Indeed.
Right, exactly.
Especially if they own cake shops. Mike Bellamy asks, can you talk more about how constitutional principles like the separation of church and state may not explicitly be stated in the Constitution, but are still ideas upheld by the Supreme Court? I see a lot of Christians who comment, quote, well, where does it say those exact words? Ha, checkmate, there's no such thing. Yeah, so this is actually, I genuinely do not understand why they think this is a powerful argument. But they do. It is online all over the place. I mean, I think there's a couple things you can do. One, you can talk about other rights that are in the Constitution that are protected but are not explicit.
Interstate Commerce Clause among them, all kinds of rights.
I think fair trial is probably my favorite one because there are a number of rights that are enumerated, but we all conceptualize it as you have a right to a fair trial. The right to privacy, which incorporates a lot. The right to travel, which incorporates a lot. All of those are not explicit.
Those words don't appear verbatim.
Yeah, but they're very important rights that we have. And then you can do what Dan does, which is flip it around and talk about all the things that Christians believe that are not verbatim in the Bible. Like
such as even the word Christmas.
Christmas, the Holy Trinity, I think, is not technically
There's a number
in there.
of doctrines that obviously come out of the Bible or are doctrines contained
Original
in...
sin, I think, is not
I don't know if that...
We have to, Dan has a whole
Christmas
list we should have had.
And so we can fight fire with fire. But of course, we should point out that the words erecting a wall of separation between church and state stem with the man of the hour, Thomas Jefferson, and he wrote that as president in response to a query from the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut, who were sympathetic with separation of church and state. They wanted assurances, and he said that that was what the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment erects, a wall of separation between church and state. And he wrote that on New Year's, I think it was 1802.
Correct.
He was working on New Year's. And he cleared it with his Attorney General. He knew this letter was historic, that it was a historic and legally significant interpretation that has been adopted very quickly in the 19th century and, of course, since then by the Supreme Court as a metaphor to explain what the Establishment Clause means.
Yeah,
so,
and they've adopted it time and time again. It speaks of a wall not as a fine line that's easily overstepped. And I mean, it is there in the Constitution too. There's in the original document, there's no mention of religion except in Article 6, Clause 3 to exclude oaths, religious oaths for public office. That's the only mention until you get to the amendments, which, were a couple of years later. And then the two religion clauses, which again exclude religion from government and government from religion. So.
And I guess I would turn the tables with the first question saying, how do we fight Christian nation? Or was it the second question? There ain't no reference to Christian nation in the Constitution or to God or the Ten Commandments. It's a godless document. Yeah. So I think that may be the best response.
I think so too. The godless Constitution.
Right, quite right.
Do we have any other questions?
I think that does it. That's all our questions for today.
Well, it was a very legal
I know, it was basically like a law school class, except we couldn't call on you.
Hey, but it's like getting a CLE credit, right?
Yeah, a little bit. A little bit.
And just very important to know this history, so.
I think so, and why we celebrate Religious Freedom Day, and that it's not about being able to discriminate against people because of their sexual orientations or anything like that.
So we were very glad to celebrate this Virginia statute for religious freedom with you. We still have it. We'll try to maintain it.
And FFRF will be here protecting it. That's what we do. But until then, join us next week on FFRF's Ask an Atheist. Thank you.